Hey friends, indirect taxes are taxes paid by firms to the government. So for example, in the US, indirect tax on cigarettes are about $1 per pack. So cigarette makers pay $1 per pack of cigarettes produced to the government, and then they pass on a fraction of this $1 tax to consumers. So these taxes are called indirect taxes because they are not directly passed on to the consumer. So why exactly do governments impose indirect taxes? There are four main reasons. Firstly, as a source of revenue for the government. Secondly, as a way to discourage consumption of harmful goods such as cigarettes or alcohol. Third, to redistribute income, especially when you tax high-income earners. And lastly, to improve the allocation of resources by reducing negative externalities. Externalities will be discussed in further detail in the next chapter, so don't worry too much about it for this particular video. This is an indirect tax diagram. I've just used phones as an example because in reality, it's unlikely for governments to put an indirect tax on phones. But let me just explain to you what this diagram is and how exactly you can reflect an indirect tax in the diagram. So the first thing you want to take note for indirect tax diagrams is that the price and equilibrium quantity are over here, right? And the first thing you'll notice is that when indirect taxes are imposed, this causes the overall supply to fall. And this is reflected in a leftward shift or even an upwards shift of the supply curve from S1 to S2. So the question is, why exactly does the supply curve shift to the left? Well, taxes increase the cost of production. And if you think about it, when taxes increase the cost of production, non-producers of phones are less willing and able to produce that particular good. So this causes the quantity of phones produced to fall from QE to QT. That is in terms of the quantity. But let's look at the price axis. Now, if you notice, there are two different price levels over here, PC and PP. What is the difference? Well, if you think about it, what happens when producers are taxed? They pass on a fraction of the tax to the consumer. So now the consumer needs to pay a slightly higher price for phones as compared to equilibrium price. And this PC stands for price that consumers pay. Now, similarly, if you're a phone producer, you need to pay a fraction of the price you receive to the government, right, as a tax. And therefore, the price you actually receive as a producer, also known as PP, is lower than the equilibrium price. So this explains that divergence in terms of price. PC is the price that consumers pay, and PP is the price that producers receive as a result of subtracting the tax. And this diagram over here, you'll see that the gap between supply curves S1 and S2 is the tax per phone produced. So earlier we've also mentioned that taxes act as a source of government revenue. And if you think about it, government revenue is the difference between what consumers pay and what producers receive multiplied by the actual quantity of phones sold. So therefore, government revenue is reflected in this diagram as the shaded red rectangle. So how exactly do taxes affect different stakeholders, and how exactly does this influence the distribution of resources in the market? Well, let's think about this in terms of the different stakeholder groups and how we can reflect these in a diagram. So before the taxes were imposed, there's just a normal equilibrium price and a normal equilibrium quantity. Consumer surplus is reflected as a green triangle, while producer surplus is reflected as a blue triangle. Now, this is what happens when there is an indirect tax that is being imposed on the free market. First, let's talk about consumers. Consumers become worse off now because they have to pay a higher price than equilibrium and they receive a lower quantity of phones. Similarly, producers also become worse off because now they receive a lower price than what they could potentially receive in equilibrium, and they also are only willing and able to supply a lower quantity of phones, as we see over here. So consumer surplus shrinks from the original green triangle to just area A in the new diagram. Similarly, producer surplus also shrinks from the blue triangle to just area D in the new diagram. Besides producers being worse off, workers will also become worse off, because with lower quantities of phones demanded and supplied, in theory, fewer workers are needed to produce phones and to sell phones. So therefore, unemployment could potentially increase as a result. Now, the only beneficiary of indirect taxes would be governments, because governments are better off. They receive revenue. And this is reflected in the diagram as the combination of areas B and C, this red shaded rectangle, as we have identified earlier. So consumers lose area B, producers lose area C, and this is being gained by the government in this diagram. But if you notice, there is this tiny triangle that talks about welfare loss, reflected in the diagram as areas E and areas F. This shows how society as a whole becomes worse off because the indirect tax that are being imposed on phones. But please take note that this is only the case assuming the market was initially producing at equilibrium in the first place over here. But we will see in the future subsequent videos that this may not always be the case when there is an externality under market failure. In such a situation, when there is an externality, society could potentially be actually better off when you impose a tax to close an externality gap. But we'll cover more about that in the next chapter. So to sum up, there are three key takeaways on indirect taxes. Firstly, and most importantly, please remember this, taxes increase the cost of production. So consumers pay more and firms receive less. Secondly, governments are the only stakeholder who benefits from taxes, as we see in this diagram, because they get tax revenue. All other stakeholders, such as consumers, producers, workers, and even society, become worse off. Lastly, taxes can either create or resolve inefficiencies. In this chapter, in this government intervention chapter, where the market initially produces at equilibrium, taxes will result in allocative inefficiency because the market is already producing at equilibrium. But as we will see in the next chapter, taxes can also help to reduce allocative inefficiency and close a market failure gap. But we'll come to that in the next chapter.